Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second session of our four-part series on clergy finances. We're going to be recording our session today so we can add it to our resource library on the diocesan website. And we hope this will be a useful tool and available for you to view anytime. In today's workshop, we'll discuss financial topics relating to your physical plant, including buildings and grounds and capital campaigns. And we are delighted to welcome the Reverend Chris Duncan to lead our session. Father Chris is rector at St. James Episcopal Church in Baton Rouge, and he also serves on the Diocesan Executive Committee. And we're grateful to have Father Chris with us today to share his experience and expertise. So, Father Chris, thanks so much.
Now, as a hookah smoking caterpillar once profoundly asked, "Who are you?" My name is Chris Duncan, as Allison shared. I am the rector of St. James in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And while here in the last 4 years, we have done a add-on or a tack-on capital campaign that has totaled, with two different back-to-back, so to speak, campaigns, totaling $6.3 million, along with historic tax credits and other things. We're in the tail end of, with maybe another year of work to do on what will end up being about $7.5 million worth of renovation, restoration, and whatnot throughout our campus. So it's a very exciting time, but that's a little bit of my background here. Before coming here, I was at St. Paul's in Katy, which is outside of Houston, one of the suburbs on the west end. And there we did a capital campaign that raised a little less than $500,000. And then in the process of that campaign, while we were collecting on it and just started the work that we were going to do in and around the campus, Hurricane Harvey hit. Hurricane Harvey, as some of you may remember, flooded much of the Houston area and surrounding area. In fact, in Katy, we had somewhere around 50 to 56 inches of rain in a matter of about 36 hours. And so really, really devastating storm. And so while we were trying to do these other exciting things that we had planned, lo and behold, along comes the storm, and we have some significant damage throughout the campus as well. So it was sort of a dual capital improvements project. One was a restoration after the hurricane, and the other was renovation that had been planned all along. And then before even going to seminary, I worked as a writer for several years, and then during seminary, helping churches during capital campaign, a sort of a third-party subcontracted group that helped with the communications during capital campaigns. So we worked with all different consultants from all around the country, all different denominations, and it was just a wonderful time and quite frankly, a learning time about how capital campaigns work, what works, what doesn't work, and not just in the capital campaign, but also in building projects themselves. And so I'm excited to be talking to y'all, which sort of leads then to that first step. That first step is identifying the need and making the plan. In other words, that need that is recognized by you, by members of the church, the vestry, or whatever the case might be, could be any sort of, it could be a whole set of things. It could be anything really. It could be deferred maintenance that has been needed to be addressed or is starting to need to be addressed. Then we have just regular, really routine maintenance, which isn't even on the slide, but is something that really we shouldn't get to the point where it's deferred, but should address it before it becomes a larger problem. We have new construction, which is always an exciting time as new buildings go up and new walls are built. But it's also, as I've said already, it's a very stressful time. It brings its own challenges. And so expansion, new needs of the community, new needs of the congregation, whatever the case might be, but identifying that need. But also, it's not just construction. It's also buying, selling, or the receiving of gifted property. Sometimes new land needs to be purchased in order to expand the ministry and expand the footprint, whether it's a school or a church or whatever the case might be. Selling property. This again, sometimes we don't need everything that we have, and there's a great opportunity that can be had by selling that property. And then the other is sometimes when parishioners die, they want to leave in their will gifting property to the church. And so we need to talk about, once we've identified one of these scenarios, how do we move forward? The other one is insurance claim, and we'll unpack that a little bit more. Growing up in the Houston area, and similar than here, now being in Baton Rouge, is the first thing I think of are natural disasters, windstorms, flooding, things like that. But of course, there's a lot of reasons why an insurance claim might be necessary. So we'll unpack all of that. But the first thing to always remember is once you have identified a need, the diocesan office needs to be contacted. Even if it's not time to talk to things like the executive board or get approval or whatever the case might be, even while it's just sort of hovering in your mind, in your imagination as a possibility or as something that needs to be addressed, it's always important to call the canon to the ordinary, call Allison, and to begin that process of inviting the conversation to begin. Because the last thing you want to do is get too far along in the planning process and then have the diocese come with really good reasons or identify things that you had not considered already. And so when it comes to these conversations, the more is the merrier, and it's going to make for a smoother process along the way. So it is important to contact the diocesan office early. And you're going to hear me say that pretty much on every slide. The next thing that you would do is once you have identified the need is to begin actually making the plan, creating a timeline. And we'll talk about all the things that are sort of entailed in that as we continue forward. But make that timeline, make the plan. What is reasonable to be done? And what are the hopes and dreams? And then what are reasonable? And what is a reasonable timeline that can happen? Ensuring that the church or no individual is put into a precarious situation financially. Well, the next thing is, given my background that I've shared about being a writer and helping with communications, this is one of the most important things is communication. Whether it is due to an insurance claim or new construction, restoration, renovation, it is important to keep not only the diocese involved, but your congregation. There should not be surprises along the way. Transparency is vital to the success of these kinds of programs and these kinds of efforts. And especially if there's going to be a capital campaign attached to it, people are less likely to give faithfully if there is not trust built up, and if there's not understanding of the need and why, answering that, starting with the question why, and then sharing that why with the congregation. And then of course, anytime in any of these scenarios, no matter what the need is, the most important thing is to be prayerful as a church leader and prayerful as a church community in and throughout this process, seeking God's will, asking for God's guidance, and then during that process to be patient, to know that it's going to take a lot of patience because things always happen. Unforeseen things, curveballs are thrown. And so as a wise man once said to me, you never pray for patience because God will give you opportunities to test your patience in that case. But know that you're going to need to be patient. And so instead, pray for peace, pray for success, pray for safety, and pray for guidance throughout that whole process. So now let's start looking at, you've identified a need that's going to lead to construction. So let's kind of start with this category first. So once again, involve the diocese early in these conversations. This is vital. It doesn't matter if it's new construction, renovation, restoration of a historic property, whatever the case might be. involve the diocese early. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about if it is due to an insurance claim, which may lead to some construction, and that might have a little bit of a different process. But when you're just doing renovation, restoration, and something of a capital improvement project, whether addressing deferred maintenance or keeping up maintenance, the first step is when that problem or that need is identified, is to create a building committee, to be a sort of subcommittee of the vestry. The vestry has so much on its plate, and this group, made up of possibly members of the vestry, preferably, but also brings in people who have some expertise in this topic, especially if possible, or who can speak to the heart and the spirit of the community and represent that voice well. This building committee is going to be the one to help lead and guide throughout this process. Of course, that doesn't mean the building committee goes and just does it themselves, but they are the sort of the riverboat guides, as I said. They are the ones to lead the boat, the ship, safely through the passage and bringing everyone along every step of the way. And so shortly after that happens, usually an architect is going to need to be acquired. Now, the fee structure can greatly vary. This is just a norm. I said 9% to 12% in fees. That's on the total cost of the project, and that's for everything, not including the master plan. And that usually varies depending on the size of the project. And it also depends on geographically where you are and what city you're in, things like that, what the market is like. So there's a lot of variables in that, but that just gives you an idea, because one of the things I think that's important to know is that this process does take some capital up front. You have to have some money that's being spent to, for instance, to consult with the architects. And a little bit, we'll talk about capital campaigns and what is necessary in that. Same thing with then once construction starts, you've got to start having a flow of revenue of some sort, helping to pay for the project and so on and so forth. And early in this project, usually I would recommend a master plan if a church does not already have one in place, to look at what is the best use of our space. Is this space able to meet our needs? And if not, what can we do to help ensure that it will continue to meet our needs? Not always necessary, but is often a very good step, especially if there's expected to be several phases of possible construction. The next thing, once you've hired an architect, the first thing, once they kind of know what the project and the need is going to be schematic design. This is a very rough outline and a lay of what the plan is, and doesn't specify like the material, things like that, but gives kind of some broad strokes of what the plan is. That stage is really important, because that's when some cost analysis can start to be shared with the owner or in the church and the building committee and the vestry now that we know everything we want to do, how much was it going to cost us? And sometimes the sticker shock can be too much, and it's time to go from the Cadillac to the Ford or the GM sedan, or whatever the case might be. And so that's where schematic design comes in. The next one is design development. This is where they start to actually put in some of the pieces and start to specify what actually would be there. What are the countertops made out of? What kind of light fixtures are we going to actually use? Things like that. And once again, the pricing becomes more and more specific. Typically when budgeting, and that's an important thing to do throughout any of these projects, whether it is construction, insurance claim, or a sale or buying of property. It's good to have a good budget that informs you along the way, and that is variable according to the changes that you encounter. And so a contingency is very, very important. You need to create a detailed budget. And at that schematic design phase, typically you're running with about a 20% contingency. Not always, but oftentimes around a 20% contingency. A design development is going to run closer to a 10% contingency when you come out of that. And then once you get to construction documents, you're going to continue to run with a contingency, but at that point, you're going to probably have a bid from your general contractor, and the GC will be in place, and you'll know what the costs are going to be. But nonetheless, as the old phrase goes, death by change order. Change orders happen. Change orders are when you encounter something that was unexpected that needs to be addressed. And so therefore, giddy up, here we go. And you got to have the funds budgeted to make sure you cover that. And so now that we've mentioned the general contractor or the GC, there's various options in how that relationship can be. In my experience, I think it is always better to bring the general contractor in at shortly after the schematic design phase and at the design development phase. And the reason is that the general contractor will have an understanding of the sort of the boots on the ground, what it's like in the field, and can help consult with the architect along those ways. And that can be really important. And in the long run, although you may have to pay some fees up front for that service, not always, depends on the general contractor and depends on the scope of the project and how their fee structure is based. But know that that can save you a lot of money in the long run because they can help give alternate solutions and insights that may not otherwise be known. And then, as I said, there's different ways. You can have a set price where the general contractor just comes in and says, here's how much the project costs. So be it. Another one is a general fee that is connected with a guaranteed maximum. And so in other words, the maximum you will pay for the project is X. And then any savings that they realize, they often get a certain percentage of those savings. So there's a fee. Then there's also a percentage of the savings that they come in under that guaranteed maximum. Again, every general contractor, and these things are pretty standardized. So it's important to ask, what is your typical fee structure? What are our options? Things like that. And as I said, then you need to have a detailed budget with contingencies. And that is going to be, again, changing throughout this process. But your first one should come into place sometime around after the schematic design phase, and then should be ready to go and honed in when you come out of the construction documents. Again, the general contractor is who's going to help inform that information and to help. And that's why it's important to have them in those conversations if possible early on. And then the other thing is, if you're doing renovation, if you're doing restoration, if you're building new construction, a church needs to make a long-term maintenance schedule. It will save you money in the long run if you address things little bit by little bit and ensure that you are maintaining it. Deferred maintenance is one of those things that can just kill a church because, not literally, but metaphorically, kill their budget at least, because something that may have cost X is going to cost twice as much in a few years, especially when it's deteriorated. And maybe it went from something being able to be fixed or repaired versus having to be replaced. And so always have a long-term maintenance schedule of how are we going to maintain? If we're going to do this, how are we going to maintain it? Another thing, and this isn't on that slide, but another thing to consider is that if you are restoring one thing, you don't want it to make it stand out. So you want to make sure you do enough that is also around it to make sure that you're addressing all those needs, and that by addressing one need, you're not making a new need become glaringly obvious, but you have run out of money or was not part of the scope that you presented to the congregation, and so you're having to go back, or whatever the case might be. So again, architects, general contractors, experts in these fields can really help with that. And that's where that building committee is going to become so important, to have those those really fun conversations, but that sometimes has to look really deep into who we are and how we maintain things and how we can make sure we're taking care and being good stewards of our property. And then generally speaking, you do not want to hire members of the congregation. It is a bad precedent a lot of times. It can also, though, create a very difficult situation if they as the general contractor has to be fired, or if they as the architect, people don't like the plan, then you feel beholden to either do this plan that no one likes, or you're really hurting feelings when you're having to change the plans or let them go. And so generally speaking, I know it's not always possible, but generally speaking, it's best not to hire members of the congregation. All right, let's change topics now. There's a lot more to construction. This is just scratching the surface of what you need to do to get sort of from point A to point B. And the next one is real estate transactions, which could include, as I mentioned earlier, I think it could be purchases, it could be sales, but it could also be gifts of real estate or other property, non-liquid, not cash, not stocks, things like that. And so the first thing, again, especially if we're dealing with real estate, is involve the diocese early, as each transaction can have opportunity and liability. And that's one of the things we don't often think about, is what's the liability with a sale, or with liability with the receiving some property from someone. So even gifts can fall into this category. So one of the first things that needs to be considered is the conditions. For instance, often we don't think about whether we're selling or buying land or receiving it as a gift. What are the environmental, was there an environmental assessment? Was there a previous, some sort of waste that was dumped onto that property or accidentally spilled onto the property? And what are the ramifications there are? What are the limits that come with that? With that also leads to what are the liabilities? Are there limitations of that liability? If you were to sell some land, and even if you didn't know that it had a previous toxic spill of some sort, and then it's sold and it damages something, how are you being held liable versus the buyer, versus also who maybe gave you the land originally? What is the local land use jurisdiction? Depending on where you are, there's zoning. Are you going to stay within the zoning that is required? And if not, what would it take to get it rezoned for what you need it to do? And all these kinds of things. I mean, there's a lot of questions that have to be asked before selling or receiving a piece of property through sales or gift. And then also the rights, the land, the actual rights of the property, mineral rights, homestead rights, all those kinds of things. And it's crazy that a lot of those things can get divided up and be split in small percentages. And so just knowing what you have and what you're selling or what you're buying is important for all the conditions of that sell, or for that sale, or for that purchase. Real estate gifts especially should typically be sold as soon as possible. And this is in most cases. If you're intending to use it for a home that's been donated as a rectory, perhaps, then again, have those conversations, make sure there's good assessments, know the condition of the place, things like that. But generally speaking, most gifts, just as what is the policy in most churches, if they receive, for instance, a stock gift, that you sell it as soon as you are possible, especially if that is the plan all along. Sitting on a hope that the market turns around or whatever the case, it's a dangerous game, and not always what is intended, or often not intended what was intended by the giver. And so to reduce your liability, to reduce your risk, it's just often better to sell those real estate gifts if you're not intending to keep them. And if you are intending to keep them, again, make sure you know what you're getting into. And then if receiving or purchasing property, then what is the long-term plan to pay for and to maintain this newly acquired property? This kind of goes back to what we talked about with construction. Acquiring a new asset such as property is filled with opportunity and possibility, but if you do not maintain it, it's just going to hurt potentially the long-term sustainability of the congregation if there's not a plan in place. And then if selling property, then how will those monies received be used to further the mission and ministry of the church? Personally, I would advise against selling property in order to address or to solve a shortcoming, a shortfall in an operating budget. Something that is very temporary in a single year. Selling property that it has a typically appreciating value is not typically the best way, not advised. But so therefore, what does it do? If you're selling a piece of property, does it allow for it to be invested? Maybe go towards addressing other maintenance issues that are in need and things like that, paying off past debt, whatever the case might be, but have a plan. Don't just say, oh, we want to sell this property. It's annoying. It's getting in the way. It's causing headaches. I get that. Slow down, make a plan, then sell that property. The next thing that we're going to talk about is moving from real estate transactions is to insurance claims. And again, as I sort of alluded to earlier, growing up on the Gulf Coast, always think of hurricanes and flooding as where most insurance claims come from. But there's a lot of different types of insurance claims. And no matter that type, I'm going to say it again, involve the diocese early in those conversations. Make sure they are informed of what is happening. So types of insurance claims, and this is not an all extensive list, but it could be theft, it could be vandalism, it could be a fire, which we have had here at St. James, natural disaster, broken pipes or water heater leaking. Again, that's another one we've had here at St. James. We had about $350,000 or so of damage from a hot water heater hose or pipe that was coming in that burst in one of our buildings. And it happens. And so you need to be ready for whatever those possibilities might be. And so there's a lot of different insurance. And usually, unlike construction, which can be nerve-wracking at times, but is often exciting, or even with the purchasing or selling of property, comes with excitement of new opportunities. Insurance claims are typically just very difficult times. If it is a theft or vandalism, the community is in shock. Same thing with a fire, or whatever. All of these, it takes a pastoral response while also having to respond quickly so that the damage that was done does not get compounded with time. And so it's a hard thing to balance. But what I would also say is with every setback, with every challenge such as this, there is also an opportunity. And for God's redemptive Easter moments to come present and become seen and present in that community. Now, if it is a theft or a vandalism, or obviously also a fire, but if it's in some way or form like that, the first phone call needs to be to the local law enforcement. Your second phone call needs to be to the diocese, and then your third phone call to your insurance provider. And so those are all important things. If there's a theft or a vandalism, you're going to want to ensure that there is a police report. Insurance is going to want to see that and to know that information. And then, as I said, calling insurance. Now, when dealing and talking with insurance, it is important to maintain very detailed inventory of content and a list of the damages with pictures of before and after when possible. And that's why it's important. The diocese here works really hard, and we often talk again about it with the natural disasters, but it's really with anything and everything, whatever any of these reasons might be, that you maintain really good records and an inventory of what you have and what the estimated value might be, and at least the year that was estimated at. And then there are different types of insurance payment systems that's set up, and I'm not an expert in insurance by any means. Well, I did have to do a lot with church insurance when I was in Katy after Hurricane Harvey but that does not necessarily make me an insurance expert. The one thing I will always say, though, is you do need to know whether your insurance policy is a full replacement value or just its actual value, because that will make a difference. Typically in full replacement, except especially when we're dealing with property, is often you'll receive a payment, and then that payment is what its value was at that time. And then that is the money you would use to get the process started to address the issue. And then a final payment for full replacement is made once that full replacement is done, filling in the gap between that initial payment and the full price. And so again, in dealing with insurance, if you have experts in your congregation, be sure to rely on them, be in communication with the diocese, but maintaining really good records is going to be the key. Now let's get back to the exciting things of construction or sales of property, purchasing a property, or whatever the case might be. Whether again, renovation, restoration, new construction, whatever it may be, there's going to have to be funds. So one is that you can use resources that you already have on hand. For instance, you can sell property in order to address this over here. You may have a designated gift, and it's always important to honor those designations. There can be, in many places, legal ramifications if you do not honor those restrictions and those wishes that came with the gift. For instance, one church I know received the exact amount of money that was needed for a new set of bells. The vestry accepted those funds. The problem was their bell tower couldn't house those bells. So they were going to have to build a $500,000 expansion and basically new bell tower in order to house this new beautiful set of bells. So know that you want to honor those gifts. And so always ask, if we accept this gift, what comes next? So anyway, those could be the resources that are on hand. But oftentimes you're going to have to look at another combination of other things, such as a capital campaign. I always, if it is a larger campaign, especially more than, I hate to say an amount because a larger amount is very relative. But if it is needed to get a consultant, if you are wanting to stretch beyond what the congregation can typically do, then it is important that you do it and you do it right. Typically, a consulting firm would come in and start with a feasibility study. To put this in conversation with that previous slide of the construction, it's sometime after the schematic design and after you've presented that and communicated that to the congregation to start also getting some feedback that you would, and it builds then excitement that you would then maybe start to do a feasibility study. Then sometime after you've done the design development, you would go into start the quiet phase and the public phase of collecting those funds. And then hopefully by the time the construction documents are completed, you'll be in what's called the redemption phase, oftentimes called the redemption phase, which is where you're collecting on those pledges. It is always a good rule to not expect to collect 100% of the pledged amount, but rather somewhere between 90 and 95%. And there's a lot more detail to this. There's a lot of different approaches that I don't have time to go into of different campaign methods. And the key is just to find the right one that fits with your community. Just because one thing worked with one church in this diocese or a church up the road doesn't mean it'll work in your community. And so just know that in general. Also, another thing, typically most churches can raise, not always, but most churches can raise a minimum of 2 to 2.5 times their operating budget. Now that statistic is pre-COVID. There's not a lot of research and evidence yet because it's all happening right now that would point to whether that continues to be possible or not. I will say we had a very successful capital campaign in the midst of COVID in 2021. But again, just because one thing worked in one area doesn't mean it's going to work in another. So, but it tends to be that you, without doing a feasibility study, oftentimes congregations can raise 2 to 2.5 times, spread out over 3, and then depending on the situation, maybe up to 5 years. I would not do a collection period or a redemption period more than 5 years. I would say 3 is the preferred length. So the next thing is historic tax credits. Historic tax credits, actually, let me go back. The key to the redemption phase is, again, communication, sharing what was happened, sharing what is happening, and then what happened, and then also sharing how what happened is helping to further the mission and ministry of the church. It's telling your story. And when you do that, typically churches can collect on more than 90%. But again, and then also as far as the percentage that you should expect, a healthy congregation will have at least 60, 65%, if not more, preferably more, obviously, but at least 60, 65% of the congregation will participate in the capital campaign. All right, now historic tax credits. I am not an expert in this, but we at St. James use these very frequently. We have several $100,000 coming in. And basically, it's here in the state of Louisiana. We as churches, as nonprofits, don't pay income tax. And so as an institution, and so what we do is we get these tax credits and then you sell them through a broker. And then in selling them, you get 20% of how much was spent on qualified items. It's a very tedious process. You're going to want to make sure someone familiar with this process helps you, or someone who understands sort of government bureaucracy and what it takes to jump through all the hoops and meet all those requirements. So that's an important step, but it is a source of funding that is out there here in the state of Louisiana, and it is, and it's been a godsend for us and has enabled us to do a lot of things. So we get 20% of every dollar that is spent that is qualified, and then from that we get roughly 89% or so. But again, depends on your broker, depends on all those kinds of things, because obviously the person purchasing it is wanting to get it at a lower price to save more money. So anyway, that's where it kind of comes in. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing that really helps maintain and restore historic buildings. The thing to always consider is that you're going to have to do a bridge loan. Unless you already have the cash on hand when you start, whether it's insurance, whether it's the purchasing of property, whether it's a renovation, restoration, new construction, you're going to have to be able to pay for it along the way. And especially if a capital campaign, if it's a 3 to 5 year collection period, then you got to have a way to get from point A to point B and to fund it along that path. And that's where a bridge loan comes in. Usually a bridge loan, like here at St. James, we gave ourselves a bridge loan through our investments, through our endowment, and are paying it back, and created a payment schedule that we then published to the congregation, because we didn't want to hurt or inhibit the future of our endowment by only taking from it and not repaying it. And that's what served as part of our bridge loan for at least the historic church renovation portion. And then the rest we're only doing when cash is on hand. So that's another way you can do it. You wait till you have cash and you do a little. That does tend to be more expensive that way, however. And so then the next thing is you can get a traditional bridge loan through some sort of banking institution or something like that, where it is basically a large line of credit with a plan for it to be rolled into a traditional loan at the end of a given period. And so that's the bridge loan. Then funding is a traditional loan. This is, it's a loan, and they give you money. There's interest that you have to pay, and you're paying more interest than principal at the front end, and you hope that you can pay it off as fast as you can. And that's where a debt reduction capital campaign can come in. But again, every church has to consider if they are planning to roll any remaining debt into a traditional loan, how are they going to pay for that? They have to have a plan. You don't want to come to the executive board and have this grand plan, and then when we ask the question, how are you going to pay for it in the long run? It's sort of like, I don't know. We had the money up front to get it started, but it's going to take up more than 15% of the operating budget. Well, that's way above what it would ever be recommended. I've often heard loan payments up to 15% of operating budget is manageable. But again, every percentage you go up of your operating budget, the more you're taking away and beginning to impact the staffing capacity, the programming, and other maintenance. So here you are, you do a bunch of stuff, and then you're taking away the money to maintain all this beautiful work you've just done. So you've got to have a plan. That's one of the repeated things. Don't just haphazardly jump into something. Know where your source of funding is coming from, how it's going to be paid, how it's going to be maintained, and then you're going to be good. You're going to be good. And then that's where, as I said, maybe a plan is in place for several years to be able to maintain that loan and roll it into a traditional loan, with a plan then to do a debt reduction campaign a little bit later. So as we kind of conclude this conversation, and as I come to the end of my time, one of the big things that you keep hearing me say is keep the diocese involved. And the reason for that is, in a way, it's the law, canon law, as my slide says, but keeping the diocese involved and informed early and often will help you get more resources and to think of things and see things that you may not have already thought of or seen. But it will also help smooth out the process, especially if you have to go and get executive board approval on what you are doing. Quite frankly, even if you don't need to get executive board approval, it is important to keep the diocese and the executive board informed, because the churches hold the property in trust on behalf of the diocese, but they do not individually own the property. The property is the diocese, and we as churchgoers maintain it to continue that mission and ministry in this place and at this time. So that's important to remember. And so what is required to come to the executive board? Well, as long as you're in communication with the diocese, you'll know, and they will help walk you through that process and what they need to hear in order to approve it. But the biggest thing is real estate transactions. Absolutely, before you buy, before you sell, and before you receive as a gift, officially receive that from and have it signed over, you need to be in communication with the executive board, and what is the plan? How is this going to be? Have you considered all those extra considerations that really need to be looked into and explored before you go too far down this path? And then the executive board and so before you ever list the property, it needs to have executive board approval. And then also, when this bill of sale has to have executive board approval. It will, if you do not do that, it could jeopardize the title and title issues and things like that. So this is very important, and to limit everyone's liability is very, very important. The other big one, and again, the diocesan office will tell you when and where you need approval. But the other biggest one is if you are encumbering the property in any way, shape, or form. So in other words, if you are and I'll say banks right now are hesitant to do this, because the last thing they want to do is foreclose on a church. Really bad press. But it's not just the church that is signing then on those loans when you are encumbering the property. In other words, you're using the property as collateral. It is also the diocese. The diocese underwrites that. And the diocese will not underwrite something if it puts them, and they're looking out for your best interest. If there is a no or a hesitancy or wanting to explore more options, it is not because they're trying to hurt your efforts to do whatever, but it's because they're trying to protect you, and they're trying to protect the diocese at large. There's a lot of liability in all of these things. And again, they're not trying to be the party poopers. They're just trying to keep the mission and ministry of the diocese and of your congregation safe. So this has been a lot of information. I'm coming to the end of my sort of 45-minute presentation. And so if there are any questions, I would welcome you to reach out to me But again, the diocese is also a wonderful resource.